Lake County. We are home to more ski resorts in our judicial district than any judicial district in the country. So yeah, I'm sure you can imagine some of the topography. It's really my great pleasure to host this with Amy tonight. I had the distinct pleasure last year of inviting out 3 exonerees from Witness to Innocence. They came out and participated in a couple panel discussions in 2 of our counties, Eagle and Summit County. And it was so impactful to all the participants and to myself especially that I had wanted to reach out again. And unfortunately, due to COVID, no one is out here in person. So Kwame, no raft trip this year, but wait till next year.
Absolutely.
And we'll go down to Colorado again. And so our 3 panelists and exonerees have been kind enough to share their time and spend the evening with us. So I want to first introduce my friend Kwame Ajamu. Kwame is from Ohio, and he spent 28 years in prison after he was convicted based on false eyewitness testimony and police misconduct. And he was exonerated from death row in Ohio in 2014. So you will hear more about his story coming up. And Amy, do you want to jump in and introduce?
Well, I think we'll just go ahead and start off with Kwame, and then we'll introduce the other folks after
Great.
that.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. Yeah. Kwame, then we will go ahead and turn it over to you if we can. And maybe just tell a little bit before your story, just a tiny bit about Witness to Innocence. I know that the organization is really dedicated to death row inmates and to trying to exonerate those that are in fact innocent. And so if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Certainly. So the primary objective of Witness to Innocence is, like you said, death row, the abolishment of capital punishment, ridding this earth of the killing, the just systematic killing of males, females, all human beings, either wrongfully incarcerated and or guilty. We just believe that there should not be a capital punishment on the world, period. As chairman of Witness to Innocence, I have had the distinct pleasure of working with men like Ron Wright, Juan Melendez, our founder, and Mr. 100 goes by the name of Ray Crone. It's like a tedious job that we have, but it's one that we all love to do. It's one that we are dedicated to doing, and that is bringing the harmony to our community, that we understand the significance of having been abused by a system that was put in place to protect and serve. And so it is our main and primary objective to see these things through. You take the matters today that's going on right now in society, and from the perspective of having been incarcerated for so many years, wrongfully incarcerated for so many years, disrespected as a human being all of my life. And I can remember, just growing up, I'm 62 years old. So I lived through the riots twice in Ohio. The 66 riots, the Huff riots, and then the 68 riots, Glenville riots. And so I can remember verbatim, as if it were yesterday, seeing these things take place in the streets throughout the cities, the downtown areas, and the burning of flags, overturning police cars, just totally disrespecting society's right to have an accomplishment of properties and those virtues. And it just is, when the hell is it going to stop? you take the situation with, and God rest his soul, George Floyd. And to Caucasian Americans, I know this is heart-wrenching. I know that none of you that are truly people who believe in what is righteous and what is fair are not saddened by this, as is Black Americans. But I want to say further that for me, for say my uncle, my father, to witness this Caucasian man put his knee on George's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and then strut like a peacock with his arms just as if he was just, my God, look at me, would remind that elder of a time when, as Billie Holiday wrote in her favorite song, Strange Fruits, how they would go from juke joint to juke joint in the South and have to ride past their brothers and sisters hanging from trees. Mm-hmm. It reminded me as a child seeing those men and women beaten and having dogs sicked on them and hoses, just for saying, hey man, I give. I fucking give. So this is a time that illustrates the need that I have been verbally perpetuating since my alliance with Witness to Innocence, and that is that we should come together as one community. Mm-hmm. The life and the blood that is spent in this world is human life and human blood. There is no black and white. It's only one blood and one life. It's human. It's only one race. It's human. We have to get up off of this high above chasing those. And for those of you who are religiously inclined, I want to take you to your scripture books, and you'll realize that anybody who follows any type of ism or better than syndrome follows Satan himself. That is the Arabic for get behind me, Satan, as you would say in English. You see, I speak these words to Allah that he would protect me from Satan. That is, I pray to Allah that he protect me from the devil. You see, because it was the devil, read your scriptures, who said to God Almighty, I don't like that creation that you made, man. I'm better than him. Amen. It was the fleeking devil that started better than syndrome. And that is what you follow when you think you're better than the next man. Mm-hmm. You see, so this is an accomplishment that we too have to follow as an organization and as a people. And this is one stride that I want to accomplish in my lifetime. I was born into what would be considered a middle-class, poor society. My family were hardworking people. You know, we were Baptist, religious people, believed in God, believed in all of the spiritual amenities that would give you holidays and the virtues of holidays and birthdays and the like. You know, my mother was hardworking. My grandparents, both my great-grandmother and my grandfather was blind, you know. So it made me realize that now in 2020, I'm sorry, we have this COVID-19 thing going on. So I made a special broadcast to the world that, you know, we should remember that the blind people have to see with their hands. So keep it clean for them. You know, this is the type of person that I am. So in 1975, at the tender age of 17 years old, when I was accosted, beat up, taken to the police station and charged with aggravated murder and sentenced to die, all before 18, put into a little bitty room that I could touch eye to wall and the ceiling all before 18, for a crime that I had no idea what had gone on, had nothing to do with it, all before 18 years of age. My good friend was only 7 months older than me, Ricky Jackson, just turned 18. My brother Wiley was 20. 39 years, those two men would stay incarcerated. After the 28 years that I was incarcerated and thus paroled through the entire system, fought another 11 years to have the exonerations come into place. And still in 2020, there's this horrific, there's this dismay, there's this melee, there's this total abandonment of human kindness. Where's the milk that we always talk about of human kindness? There's so much hatred in the streets right now that it's not COVID-19 that I'm afraid of out there. It's human beings. It's human beings. I want to thank you for being able to allow me to say these things unabashedly.
Well, Kwame, and thank you so much for sharing, your story with, not just with us, but with the world, because I know you do this now,
Certainly.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
This is your job. This is what you do.
This is what I do.
Thank you. And I know that we're going to move on to Juan and to Ron, but before we do, can you just speak and say a few words? When you were out here last year, you had made a comment, and if you could just elaborate on that a little bit. You said there are no rich people on death row.
True.
And that really stuck with me. I remember those exact words, and if you could just comment on that a little bit.
So I'm sure that the two brothers are laughing hearing that, but that is the absolute truth. And this gets into how you define the constitutionality of what is right and what is wrong with sending people to their doom statewide. Yes, true. There is no one on death row who could, out of his or her pocket, afford a lawyer. No. As time go on, folks come in, help them, people put up their houses, friends, whatever. But there is not one $85,000 a year making person on death row in America. And the sad part about it is that the system recognizes that first. They recognizes that first in the weed out process. It's almost like redlining in the neighborhoods, It's almost like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly, a disparity. And while it's obvious, I thought your words were very poignant and clearly you drove it right home. So
yeah,
thank you. Amy, I'll turn it over to you to introduce Juan.
Yeah, so I will just, Kwame, if you could, when you were out here last in Colorado, Heidi and I heard you speak about the circumstances of how you were wrongfully convicted and then exonerated. And I think our audience might be really interested to hear just a few more details about that before I turn it over to Ron.
So, you mean the compensation part of the exoneration? Or, oh.
No, just the kind of the underlying facts, because Heidi and I know your story, but I think the other folks watching on Facebook don't. Just, what the crime was you were accused of.
Okay, I got
and
you.
How
Sort of
at
like
the end of the day you ended up being exonerated, because it's such a compelling story.
Right. So what had happened, I spoke just briefly a minute ago about having been 17 years old when this happened in 1975. And there was a Caucasian man, Harold J. Franks, 59 years old, USN money order salesman that came into the neighborhood to pick up his last business there, the Fairmount Cut Rate. He was, of course, robbed and murdered. The proprietor of the store, Miss Anna Robinson, was shot in her neck as she looked out of the store. There was a young kid in the neighborhood, Edward Vernon, 12 years old, who was the paper boy and the neighborhood friend. He knew us all. Popped off when the cops asked, did anybody see it? Sure, I did. And so they took him in. And to find out, you know, he's a habitual liar. But the thing with that was, and this is where the coercion came in my case, Edward's mother was dying of ovarian cancer. We didn't know that at the time. And she was in university hospitals, very, very sick. And so they told this 12-year-old kid that if he didn't say that what he had told them initially, that he saw Kwame and Ronnie, which I was Ronnie at that time, Ronnie and Wally and Ricky do this crime, they would go and arrest his mother and charge her with his crime because he was too young, but she was an adult, you know, and they'd have to take her out of the hospital to do it. And so he immediately, you know, flipped and went back and said that, of course, these guys were who I saw. And so we would be on his testimony and that testimony alone, tried, sentenced to death. It would take 39 years completely, from 1975 to 2014 for the exoneration. But in between that, I would do 28 years through the system, create school in the prison system and the NAACP in the prison system and a pre-release program in the prison system. So all these good things worked to my merit. And after 28 years, I went to the parole board and they gave me a parole, which is what started my quest to end the capital punishment and get my brothers out of prison. So I would go on to meet up with Cal Swenson, young kid, was a freelance writer for a Cleveland Scene, a free magazine. And I met up with Kyle and through a lawyer, Terry Gilbert. And he and I conversed for maybe a week. And he read all the transcripts. I had all the transcripts. He said, my God, first I want to say to you that I'm sorry. You know, he said, there's no way just reading these transcripts that any of this is true. He said, there's 4 different, my brother had won a retrial and he took him back and found him guilty and resentenced him to death. So we had 4 murder trials actually. And Kyle told me, he said, there's 4 different testimonies from one person saying that you did 4 different things in each trial, which was the young kid, Edward Vernon, because of course he didn't know the story. They was making it up as he went. So Kyle wrote a story called What the Boys Saw. And we published it hoping for a miracle, but it didn't happen. And he moved to Florida. I was very hurt by that, you know, thinking he had abandoned me, but he didn't. He was just, you know, he's working, getting a job. Came back to Ohio and he wrote another one, Good City, Bad Cops. And this took off. Edward Vernon had a nervous breakdown. Now he's 53 years old. His kidneys is failing. He's alcoholic, drug addict, everything, you know. So his life is beating him down. And so he had a nervous breakdown when he goes into the hospital and he confessed to the some pastor and the doctor, you know, hey man, I ruined 3 men's lives, you know. And from that point on, the case would go miraculously fast. It went from his confession to me sitting right here talking to you now in a matter of 5 years. But yeah, he did that. We filed and won on his recantation, won with the certificate of innocence is what you need in the state of Ohio. I don't know about anywhere else, but in the state of Ohio to file a lawsuit against wrongful incarceration. And so we achieved all of that in the first go round. And so I was compensated firstly by city, and then lastly, most recently, just a few weeks prior, the Cleveland Police's estate. And so I'm very proud of that because now I can, you know, I can relax and take care of my family, you know, from all the things that I had missed in their lives. But I'll tell you, in all honesty, that I wouldn't risk this road on anyone, even though I've accomplished so many things in the movement towards death penalty abolition and just the milk of human kindness. I believe in all human rights and civil rights. But it is something that I will do to my last breath because I've become dedicated and it just feels good to me now. it just feels good.
Great, and thank you so much for sharing that. And just so you know, our state legislature recently repealed our death penalty here in Colorado, which was
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
an amazing thing, and I'm happy to hear that. And just so how old were you when you were granted parole and finally released from prison?
So 45. I went in at 17. I was 45 years old. And yeah, and I tell you, the world had changed so much. I didn't know that you had to put dollar bills to the bus. I was still trying to do the change thing, you know. They had the little thing, you know, just amazing. But yeah, 45 when I came out. And
All right,
man.
great. Well, thank you so much. And we're going to turn over to Ron now, and then we'll have some questions at the end. But so I'd like to introduce Ron Wright. And Ron comes from a little bit of a different background. It's my understanding he was a deputy sheriff in Orange County in Florida and spent, I believe, 3 years wrongfully incarcerated on murder charges based purely on circumstantial evidence, and recently exonerated from Florida's death row, I believe, in 2017. And so, Ron, we really appreciate you joining us. If you could tell us a little more about, you know, your case in particular and how that evolved, and then, you know, other issues that you think it's important for our audience to hear about.
Well, thank you for having me. My case began with a double homicide that I had a familiar relationship with. It was a woman I knew with a child that I had fathered, and I wasn't aware of it. From what I'm told, the police had a choice to make between me or the teenage daughter, who stood to collect over $500,000 in life insurance. And I would later learn that they completely dismissed that altogether, and everything from the word go was all focused on me. As you said, it was a wholly circumstantial case, and altogether, I was incarcerated for about 8.5 years. I spent like 4 years in pretrial confinement, finally got to trial, was convicted. Then 1.5 years later, I was sentenced. And then I sat on death row for about 3 years before being exonerated and released. This was a case where I don't really blame the police so much. It was more or less what the prosecutors did in the courtroom that really astonished me. I came away after 4 weeks of trial thoroughly believing that this case was not about the truth. It was about which side had the better story to convince 12 members of a jury to vote in their favor. One of the problems I had with the prosecutors is they really did not know the truth. And I've come to see that there are two things members of a jury will never know. They'll never know that the two people at the prosecutor's table telling them this story is not telling them the truth. The other thing they don't know is that those prosecutors may not even know what the truth is. This is where the evidence, these circumstances that they have, are shaped and molded into the story they want to tell the jury, and lack any evidence whatsoever to support it or substantiate any of it. I even had one member of the sheriff's corrections team down there tell me, well, you know, it's their story. They get to tell it the way they want to. And that's exactly what they did. During the course of the trial, there were many errors made, and the judge was not very favorable to us at all. But afterwards, we renewed our motion for the judgment of acquittal a second time. I went back to the trial court for that, and of course, he again denied it. Well, subsequently, you know, in the state of Florida, all death penalty cases are required to be reviewed by the state Supreme Court. It's called a direct review or a direct appeal, but it's an automatic process. It's going to happen whether you want it to or not. Even if you pled guilty and confessed, they still have to review every death sentence case. Normally, it depends on the time frame with the scheduling for the briefs, but I think my oral arguments were heard in April of 2017, and my appellate attorney was preparing my family for the long drawn-out wait, because it's usually months and months and months before you get a decision back from them. Turns out it was less than 30 days if you take out the weekends that they don't work. They came back unanimously deciding to reverse the convictions, vacate the sentence, and remanded it back to the trial court, directing them to enter a judgment of acquittal. And I heard that it made all kinds of legal circuits down in that particular local area. But I think my case was more a matter of one of who they could get the easier conviction against. Was it the black guy who was the baby's daddy, or the white teenage daughter that collected all this insurance money? You know, who could you convince a jury to convict easier? Naturally, I became prime suspect and public enemy number one for that. It was a very high profile case. And I think during the course of the trial, they did an absolute excellent job of insulting my integrity and assaulting my character. The evidence they actually presented evidence that worked in my favor. The DNA issue that was involved actually turned out to be beneficial to me. They also called a witness from I think it was Sprint Cellular Company, to testify to the whereabouts of my cell phone, and showed me nowhere near the scene of the crime or the location or even in that county. Showed me right where I was supposed to be in South Tampa, which is Hillsborough County. But I remember seeing the state attorney's investigator take the stand and testify that they got the case 11 months later as an unresolved homicide. And from what my attorneys tell me, that basically means the police saw no probable cause to arrest and charge me with these crimes. But when all felonies that are required to be reported to the state attorney's office, they then have the prerogative to continue to investigate. And if they so desire, they can, will charge someone and go forward. And I was the one they picked. But everything they came to court with was basically no evidence of my committing the crime, being complicit, or even having knowledge of it. But yet and still, a jury convicted me. And I have to give the Florida Supreme Court a lot of credit. I watched a lot of oral arguments before and after my case, and I told my appellate attorney, you're going to get drilled by these guys. They really get into this thing, and they have very pointed questions. They want, they can do what a jury can't, which is interact with the counsels and ask direct questions. And I actually felt kind of bad for the assistant attorney general in my case, who was trying to keep me on death row, because she seemed so empty-handed and at a loss with some of their questions that I couldn't believe that two prosecutors were able to pull this off in front of a jury, whereas you're looking at the lay people of the community, not, 7 Supreme Court justices who are well-versed in the law and can read through all the fine lines and the smoke and mirrors and everything. But I think one of the biggest issues we have going on today, as I became aware of, is a matter of wrongful convictions happening that should never happen. It's one of the reasons I'm opposed to the death penalty, because if we can't get something right, then I believe we shouldn't be attempting to do it at all. And I applaud the state of Colorado for repealing that death penalty law in your state. One of the things that I found very striking to me with these wrongful convictions was how they were happening throughout the course of a trial. And one of the things that I'm looking for in our local elections for state attorney now is who's going to end the practice of these so-called jailhouse informants. In the county I was in, which is Pinellas County, it's a very common practice, and I think one to an extent that is encouraged, because what happens is if someone is put in a position to have contact with you, and then all of a sudden they show up saying, hey, I got something to say about this guy's case. And then they get called to court to testify, and right out of their own two lips, they tell an outright bald-faced lie that in most cases, the prosecutors know they're lying. But they have the ability to step back and say, well, I don't know if he said it or not, but this is what this witness told us. And then they say, well, the jury has a right to hear that. We had one guy who was actually called the hardest working state attorney in the Pinellas County Jail. I think he had jumped on probably upwards of 20 people's cases and came back to testify in all of them. But in most cases, they know these guys are known professed liars, and they use them because their testimony is critical to establishing some more direct evidence in the record that can not only win them the conviction, but sustain it on appeal. And I think that's a practice that needs to be stopped. Anybody who wasn't at the scene at the time and had direct knowledge of what took place should not be called to testify in any criminal action. Not only that, but somebody who's incarcerated under pending prosecution should also be excluded. I remember being in the housing pod once, and a guy that was in jail, he got convicted, he went to prison, and he came back to testify in another guy's case. And after he testified, they immediately scheduled a hearing in his case. And the hearing in his case was to reduce his sentence. Now, he wasn't told beforehand what he was going to get in return for his testimony. That way, it could be said that he wasn't promised anything in return or coerced or, anything like that in any way. But in that hearing, I think they got him 3 months off of his sentence. And when he came back into the housing pod, he sat down at the tables I was at, just shaking his head in pure disgust and frustration. I asked him, well, what happened? What's wrong? He said, 3 months. I said, man, you probably already done that. You do that in your sleep. What are you worried about? No, that's all they're giving me for helping them get this guy. I'm like, 3 months? And are you kidding? And this is a guy who went to prison and was brought back to testify. But I think one of the problems is when you're in custody, you're in their facility, meaning the sheriff's jail. Now, we all know there's attorney-client privilege, and we all know the fact that anything gleaned, through any means at all can't be used if it's covered under attorney-client privilege. What a lot of people don't know is just because it can't be used doesn't mean they can't know about it. Even your attorney visitations in the jail can be recorded because all those rooms are subject to having cameras and microphones for safety and other purposes. However, one of the things that I didn't agree with is the fact that they could send somebody to get close to a defendant in jail and not record that so that the jury can hear it coming out of the mouth of the defendant himself, rather than have somebody sitting there lying through his teeth saying, this is what he told me. And we find out later with so many recantations, like in Kwame's case, that far too many people are being coerced, if not simply allowed to do that. And that's another practice that needs to stop, because it not only leads to wrongful convictions, it leads to the ruining of a lot of people's lives that unnecessarily, happen. As you alluded to earlier, I was an Orange County Sheriff's Deputy. I also worked for the Eatonville Police Department in Florida and spent a couple decades in the military, both in law enforcement and counterterrorism. I got into handling a bomb dog, and that pretty much dropped me in the worldwide war on terror after 9/11. None of that mattered. None of that made any difference. I can't tell you how many people's lives I saved, how many people I've helped, or how many bombs we've stopped from going off, but that all pretty much went out the window. And it was kind of disheartening and saddening to hear a jury say guilty, and then later on, I can't possibly verbalize the feelings and the emotions that come into play when you hear a judge say death is the appropriate sentence, and now you're going to prison to await to be essentially killed for something you did not do. I think the day that everything really hit me and hit me the hardest was the first day of trial during jury selection. They had this huge jury pool of 120 people that they divided into two groups. And in the first group of 60, as you probably well know, the first thing the judge does is gives everybody the opportunity to explain why they should be excused, because naturally nobody wants to serve on jury duty, just by nature. Well, in that first group, one lady stood up and she said that she'd previously lived somewhere up north and she served on jury duty. It was a murder trial. They did vote to convict this man, and then they voted for the death sentence. Well, subsequent to that, he was eventually executed. And in due time after the execution, they discovered the actual guilty party, and he confessed to everything. And her reason for being excused was simply because she never wanted to be a part of that process of making such a horrible mistake ever again. So I think for those other exonerees that sit in my position, they know their own individual cases and circumstances. But I think for people who have never been through something like this, really don't have a full understanding and grasp of it. And I tell people all the time, as a sheriff's deputy, I'm out arresting people, taking them to jail. My involvement in that case basically ends the second I clear central booking, because unless I'm called to testify, I'm out there on to the next call, helping the next person something else to go do. We got calls holding, I'm racing to the next call. I never gave much thought to the death penalty. I never found out how much time anybody convicted in one of my cases received or followed up on any of that. But since being dropped dead square in the middle of this whole thing, it all comes full circle and puts it, forefront in my mind now. And I pay attention to a lot of these things now because of how oblivious I was to everything before. And, you know, look at me, a cop, a military guy, you know, an unblemished record. Who'd have thought this would ever happen to somebody like me? And I'm going to take race out of it for a moment because of all the attorneys and investigators and other support people that worked on my case, only one other woman was Black. So this whole legal team did an absolute fantastic job, both in the courtroom and on appeal, to save my life. And I'm eternally grateful for that. I tell people these days that when you go to trial, you're actually fighting two battles at one time. First, you want to be proven innocent, but in the case that you don't prevail, your second battle is to secure that record so that on appeal, you have a chance at prevailing. Mm-hmm. And there's just so many people in these jails that are sitting waiting on trial that don't think about those things, and they have no idea what lies ahead of them. And that goes the same and even double for those out on the street these days, because they have no idea, you know, what awaits them down the line when they put themselves in certain circumstances or situations that makes them, you know, leads to them being subject to prosecution. And it's a horrible fight, a terrible battle. I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, but at the same time, I think it all starts and stops with the police, but then it gets carried on by what the prosecutors do in the courtroom. And that's where I think a lot of people, if they paid more attention to that, were more aware and understanding of that process and how some of these certain tactics and courtroom strategies are used, they would have a totally different, you know, view of things as a member of the jury. I remember we had a ton of pretrial hearings before my trial, and my lawyer got so frustrated because in the pretrial hearings, when we asked the judge to deny a state's motion, the state would then give some explanation or reason saying, no, Your Honor, that's not what we're doing. We're doing it for this reason. And then turn around at trial and do exactly what they said they were not doing. I remember in one of the pretrial hearings, we were actually seeking our own independent DNA expert. There was one particular item, a glove that was found. And while the state was arguing against us, the prosecutor said himself on the record, Your Honor, I don't know why the defense wants to do further testing on an item that has already excluded the defendant. And then they turned around at trial and relied on that same item to accuse me and convict me with it. So this is one of those things where I think for most people at large, we're just highly unaware of what all goes into this, just like a lot of people don't know what goes into being a police officer or what it's like to serve in the military and combat. And when it happens to you, it's a total shock, to say the least. So I look at these things going on out in society today, and I look at it from two sides of the fence, because on one hand, I don't deny that there's racism and a lot of oppression and injustice out there. But on the other hand, I see a lot of good cops, a lot of good people. And I know that this is not simply a bad cop problem. This is a bad human being problem, just like any other bad human being that does a bad thing. That police officer in George Floyd's case, the mistake he made was where he put his knee and where he kept it. What we're trained to do is put the knee in the center of the back between the shoulder blades. That's the ideal position to control somebody without harming or touching anything vital like a carotid artery or the windpipe where they can die from that. I'm sure this man, being an experienced, seasoned, trained law enforcement officer and training officer, knew that. I can't say he's a racist or not, but one of the things I can say is the mistake he made was a fatal one, and it's one that should never have been made like that. So I think what happens is people see that video, and for the most people in society, you know, they've often denied the fact that there's all this going on. Well, the truth is, it's always been there. The problem is you weren't there to see it with your own eyes, so you didn't know. And when you heard about it, it was easy to dismiss it. Well, what's happening now is there's these cell phones with cameras out there, and then these videos are being put on this new thing called the internet, where it lives in perpetuity. And these officers in that case in South Georgia, a lot of people believe they weren't charged because there was a video. They were charged because the rest of us saw that video. It's undeniable, it's irrefutable, and it can't be simply explained away, swept under the rug, or easily dismissed and forgotten about. So I think what I'd like to see happen is a lot more awareness and education to a lot of people, And maybe then they'll better understand just what's going on out here in society that they see or may not see, but actually does exist and has for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's very compelling and very timely and pertinent points that you raised about things that we absolutely have to do better in the criminal justice system. So I'm going to turn back over to Heidi to introduce our final panelist, Juan Melendez.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Ron. I echo what Amy says. You have a unique perspective because you have been on both sides. You have been a law enforcement officer and someone who has been arrested and convicted. And so thank you for sharing your perspective. And again, thank you for your service as well.
Thank you.
And Juan, I guess that leaves what the best for last, isn't that right?
Yeah, I'm going to try to do the best.
Well, we're looking forward to it. So I want to introduce Juan Melendez. Juan actually spent 17 years on death row after he had been convicted based on perjured testimony and also prosecutorial misconduct. He ended up being exonerated, again, out of Florida from death row in 2002. And Juan, we are very much looking forward to hearing your story.
I will start by saying it's an honor to be here. I want to thank you, all of you, for inviting me to do this. And I want to thank Witness to Innocent. And I'm so glad to see Ron and my friend Kwame. And my case is, it was based on circumstantial evidence. A common story man got his throat slashed, was shot 3 times, and was a white man. He used to live in the African American community. He was also to the investigation, he was also a homosexual, but he was also had a good reputation helping the African American community. But anyway, he gets killed, he gets robbed. The case got getting called. After 48 hours, they don't get nobody charged. Something wrong can happen. So it was called for about 6 months. Then came what they call a police informant, saying that what they call in the streets a snitch, saying that I confessed the crime to him. Implicates a friend of mine, African-American person, a brother. He gets arrested, gets interrogated. He makes 15 statements. He incriminate himself in the crime. And this is how he incriminated himself in the crime. They use what they call a lie detector agent, the one that do the lie detector test. Where the lie detector agent was acting like a police agent. So they got him to make 15 statements. And in the end, he confessed to the crime. He implicates me in the crime, and he implicates his cousin in the crime. So anyway, the other evidence was the police informant saying that I confessed to him. Everything that the police informant, the snitch say in trial was information already based on the general public to the media. In other words, he said I shot him with a 38. The newspapers say he was shot with a 38 and so on, so on. He never gave no inside information that only the police know or the perpetrators. So that's the entire evidence, no physical evidence against me. There's the 2 testimony. I had an alibi witness. I have four witnesses corroborating the alibi testimony. I had other witness testifying that the police informant, the snitch, had a grudge against me. But I had a problem. Every witness that I had on my side was from the African-American race. Black woman, black man. And when a black woman and a black man testified for the defense, for the prosecutor, all of a sudden they got good credibility. They even dressed them. I never saw my co-defendant with a 3-piece suit on. I never saw my co-defendant with a clean shave. In the streets, they used to call him the wolf. But when a black woman and a black man testify for the defense on my side or its own, the credibility is gone. So the trial started on Monday, picking the jury. Tuesday, we still picking jury. Tuesday evening, they read instructions to the jury how to conduct themselves in the capital murder case with a sinking the death penalty. Wednesday, the evidence come in. I already explained that. Thursday, they found me guilty. Friday, the very next day, 10 o'clock, a little bit after 10 o'clock in the morning, I was already sentenced to death. And the judge complained that it was taking too long. When he sent me to death, very disappointed the system. I could not believe it. I was angry, very angry. And through the trial, I'm believing that I'm going to go home. Through the trial, to the soul, they show the jury that the pictures from the crime scene. It's a man with his throat slashed in there. He shot 3 times. His blood everywhere. The pictures in colors, but that big. When their jurors saw them pictures, they looked straight at me with hate in their eyes. That's when I know this Puerto Rican was in some big trouble. So going back when I went to death row, it was a terrible experience. I suffered a lot, but my family did too. My mama, my aunts, they suffered, writing constantly letters, keeping me alive. People in the streets, people, pen pals, they helped me survive. They condemned men. I did not know how to read. I did not know how to write. I did not know how to speak English. But guess who? Guess who taught me? The worst of the worst. The ones that sometimes they consider called monsters. Taught these Puerto Rican how to read, how to write, how to speak English. If they would never taught me, I know I would never survive. I would not be able to communicate better with my lawyers. I would not be able to reply the letter that so many pen pals wrote me. Some of them for the great state of Colorado, that I'm so proud that I abolished the death penalty. I worked real hard in there, and I felt real good when I got it abolished. That showed me so much love, so much compassion, that made me feel like a human being. Today, I'm angry for the things I see what's going on. I'm not going to tell you no lie. I never was scared of the police. I always confront them and never was scared of them. Some of them was good and some of them was friends. They thought of the police, and when I was a kid, they friends. They're supposed to help you. So I never was afraid of none of them. But today, I am very afraid. I'm 69 years old, going on 70. And I saw in the TV when that man police hit that 75-year-old man, knock him down. Then went by. Oh yeah, I'm afraid now, very afraid. And I'm telling you, we need prosecutors. We need polices. With all of you, we'd be a messed up world. We need all of you. And I know some good ones. They're trying to do the right thing. And I feel good when I'm talking to all 3 of you. I know you're going to do the right thing for that greatest state of Colorado that I love so much. I think we need reforms, carefully with the police informants. Just like my friend Ron say, they can tape record every damn thing in there. And that way we know who's telling a lie, who's telling the truth. I remember when they interrogate me, it was 2 police. They came interrogate me, and they came with pizza. They came with soda pops, and they was telling me they came with what they call it, a tape recording. They never crank it up because they only crank that tape recording when you incriminating yourself. So I just listening. And then I told them this like this. And I'm swallowing the pizza and drinking the soda as fast as I can because I know they're gonna kick me out of there. So in the end, he told me, the police they said, well, what you think about this? One thing he told me, he said, in the streets they say you dress black. You like to dress black. You know what that means? You know what I told him? I said, the only reason I dress black because the ladies say that I look good in black. That's all. And then when they asked me, what do you think about all of this evidence we got against you? I told him, you know what my mama told me when I was growing up? My mama told me that if the police ever stop me, give him my name, give her her name, give her the address, and tell him to talk to me. So you don't talk to him. So I told him, so I'm gonna give you my mama. And you can talk to my mama. He said, that's when they kicked me out of there, and that was it. In my case also, the prosecutor was a lot of what they call withholding exculpatory evidence, and all you aware of that, the Brady Rule violation. It was information that this a man named Bernard James did information, more evidence. In the end, even found physical evidence against him. So it took exactly 17 years, 8 months, and 1 day. And I count that day because that's the day that I feel like I born again. I'm like Kwame, I'm like Ron. We fight against the death penalty, and any injustice we see, when it's all based, it's all around the death penalty anyway. So, and I like to talk more to the detention centers, to the kids, but I open my mouth every time I see anything that I know is not right. So thank you for having me, and any question, I'm still here. And I know my friends they're here and they will answer too.
Well, Juan, thank you. And you said that you're right. We do need police officers and we do need prosecutors, but we also need you to continue to speak and to help educate all of us on your experiences and on the wrongs that are done to people. So thank you for speaking.
I'd like to say this before we leave. I do not hate the prosecutor that did this to me. I do not respect him. If he's out here in front of my face, we're going to be looking like two pink bulls. But I would like for him, I would like to be compensated. They only gave me $100, a pair of pants, and a t-shirt, but they didn't have to give me nothing. I would have walked out of there butt naked. I would like the prosecutor to apologize to me. Mm-hmm. In the state of Florida. That's more important to me than anything. Because if that prosecutor apologized to me, now I can work on him in the human race. And him and I together can walk and talk and educate people. That's what I like for that prosecutor to do, to apologize.
Well, and that actually kind of brings up one of the questions that I'd like to pose to all three of you. I know, Kwame, you touched on it just a little bit, but right now, this country is talking about police accountability as well. We should, based on what we've seen happen over the past several weeks now. But has any compensation or any civil lawsuit been filed in your case, Juan, or your case, Ron, in order to make amends or reparations for what you have lost? And like I say, I know, Kwame, I'll open it up to you. I know that you did touch on that a little bit.
So, I went the whole course where I went federal and state all the way to the 1983 which I just won a decision a few weeks back from city of Cleveland, state of Ohio, with a landmark decision for compensation for exonerated, especially death row exonerees. But again, it came with the diligence of the work that was put in, the effort that was put into the work. And then finally, the judgment being that we were decreed innocent. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And Ron, what about you?
Florida has a statute titled Victims of Wrongful Incarceration, where there is a monetary compensation. Excuse me. You're also entitled to have your record expunged, and you're also given, I think, like 30 semester credit hours for free at any state college or university. However, if you read that statute, there's a lot of roadblocks in the language in there that they basically can hide behind, because the statute requires you to file a petition before the original sentencing judge. That judge, who's already adjudicated you guilty, then had to turn around and reverse that, has now got to make a determination that you are in fact a victim of wrongful incarceration. Well, there's some problems with the statute, such as the clean hands provision, which says anybody with a prior violent felony conviction is not eligible for it. It's something we've been working to change. Another problem is it has language in that statute that requires you, as the acquitted or exonerated individual, to produce evidence of what it calls actual innocence. Well, hell, if I had that, I'd have never been charged and convicted in the first place. So based on that, I was denied, my petition was denied by the trial court and affirmed at the Second District Court of Appeal without opinion. So what we're doing now is we're in the process of filing a federal civil rights lawsuit. But it's like the statute has its own inherent roadblocks written into it. I think to date, from what I've been told, only one or maybe two people have ever actually benefited from the statute in Florida, which obviously needs some serious revamping.
Mm-hmm.
And Juan, since your conviction was also in Florida, were you subject to that same statute, and what was your experience?
I'm going to tell you, the first thing I'm going to tell you, I'm very proud of Ron. I'm very proud of Seth. I'm very proud of Hellman. They be trying to help us in this conversation. I'm going to tell you the truth. When I got out of there, they gave me $100 pair of pants and a t-shirt, and that was it. And when the reporters asked me, then I'm thinking to sue the state. You know what I told them? I say, that's lawyer business. I'm not a lawyer. But to my understanding, they're gonna sue us. See, when I got out, Florida had no compensation. And then I did a little lobby, but the only way you couldn't get money out of Florida at my time is through legislation. So I had people working the legislation, but it ain't up in nothing. The only two that I know that the Freddie Pitt case, they got some money, but through the legislation, not through it. So I don't really know. I'm glad I hear what Ron's saying, and I know they will keep any Florida exoneree informed of the compensation. So that's one of the things I'm so glad this question came up.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Well,
Great.
one of the problems with the Florida statute is when you file that petition, and it goes back before the original sentencing judge, it actually triggers that adversarial process. So now you've got the prosecutors from the state attorney coming in to argue against you. And if you happens to make it up to the District Court of Appeal, it's the state's assistant attorney general. So in essence, you're basically being put on trial all over again, because they're still arguing like you're the guilty party, and they still think you're the one that should be locked up or still on death row for it. So it's really hard to, overcome that when that's what the statute itself, mandates.
Okay.
Great.
I want to ask you
go
if I could jump in on that Florida
Yep.
thing, Ron. Ron and Juan, I wanted to ask you also, isn't it somewhere also in there, if you didn't have a squeaky clean record prior to being wrongfully incarcerated, also that would also eliminate chances of being compensated?
Yeah, that's the clean hands provision they've been trying to change for a few years
Okay.
now. I remember sitting on death row watching Herman Lindsay giving testimony before committees trying to argue against that.
Right.
Hey, Ron, let me ask you a question. How about the DNA? They say you got to have DNA. That's still around. If you don't have DNA in your case, forget
Well,
about.
The statute doesn't require DNA evidence specifically. What they basically want you to do is show up with some sort of overwhelming evidence that says you actually are innocent, like you go out and investigate your own case and find out what all the Brady violations were and all the evidence that was exculpatory to say, hey, I didn't do it and they should have known I couldn't have been the one that did it. But the problem is, excuse me, the problem is you don't get access to everything that went down during the investigation that they don't turn over in discovery. Not only that, but for you to turn around and have to produce evidence of what's called actual innocence, that is what I believe is shifting the burden from the state, who has the burden of proving you guilty, to you now having the burden of proving yourself innocent. Well, I'm not here to prove myself innocent. I'm here to ask for compensation for what the Supreme Court of the state of Florida has already said I did not do. So, and they act like the Supreme Court's ruling is pretty much irrelevant.
Yeah.
Exactly. It has no place in that at all. It's like they have nothing to say about it.
Great. So before the next question for the panelists, there's a question I think for Heidi and me, I understand from the chat, about what our thoughts are on the use of jailhouse informants and how to prevent wrongful convictions about that. And so, you know, I think when you're using a jailhouse informant, you know, it's rife with the potential for abuse. And I think we've heard stories about that because the jailhouse informant didn't witness any of the underlying activity, but they have, you know, heard or claimed to have heard the defendant make these statements, but because they're statements of the defendant, they're not excluded under hearsay. And so, you know, they will often get introduced unless there's some other reason to exclude them. And so that's a huge problem. And I'm sure Heidi's has some other thoughts on that. But as far as wrongful convictions, one thing that I'm very concerned about in the office where I'm running, it's the largest judicial district in the state. And we do have a conviction integrity unit there, but that's comprised completely of unpaid volunteers. And they are limited to looking at cases of actual innocence. And so, you know, I don't think it's right to expect unpaid volunteers to do that important work. That should be paid employees that do that work. And they should be able to look at issues of constitutional violations or disparate sentences or things like that. And so I think that's that will be something that I beef up when I take over and make sure that we have, you know, paid staff taking a hard look at the cases, and, you know, preferably former criminal defense attorneys or criminal investigators, because in the current unit, not surprisingly, they haven't found a single instance of a wrongful conviction. And again, this is the biggest judicial district in the state. And so Heidi, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that topic.
So I do on the jailhouse informants, and there is, you know, COVID has stopped a lot of the legislation, at least in the state of Colorado, simply because the legislators haven't been able to put the amount of time in. And so I do think that it'll come back up, but there is some proposed legislation about jailhouse informants. And one of the big pieces in Colorado that is being pushed for is a repository of information about the informant, to know whether or not this person has been a jailhouse informant before, if this is the first time or if this is the 27th time, and that information needs to be made available. I don't have any issue with that information being made available. I think that goes just like toward any witness's credibility. You know, what is their motivation for testifying? And you know, Amy's right. There are certain rules of evidence where a defendant has a right to remain silent. No defendant, you know, she or he does not have to testify, and that can't be used against them. But any statement from the defendant, for the most part, there are a couple exceptions, statements from the defendant are admissible, and they can be, they can come in through other people who have heard those statements. So if there are individuals, right, who are sharing cells that, from an evidentiary standpoint, that's a lot of the times how that happens. But I do think it's critical that everyone understands that, and the jury understands, and that they're told that this person's credibility obviously needs to be taken into account by any jury. Why are they informing? What benefit are they getting out of it? What was promised to them, right, for testifying, right? What did the police or the jail or the district attorney promise that they would do in exchange for this testimony?
If I may, this is one of the reasons I often say, when you're in custody and there's the ability to do any kind of recording, whether it be on the person or in the room or whatever the case is, the jury, they can scrutinize anyone's credibility while they're on the stand. The problem is they still don't know that that individual is actually lying. So to produce a video or an audio recording so the jury can hear this own individual's mouth say these words takes all that stuff completely, out of doubt. And that's what I think we need to do better at, because it's just been too many times that these statements have been recanted. These people have turned around and said they were promised something, or we hear of these improper interview tactics being, taking place. But the one thing that I think would make our judicial system much more fair is for us to have all of the facts. We ask witnesses to come take the stand and take an oath to tell the truth, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But we don't have the prosecutors doing that when they're putting these people on the stand, that 9 times out of 10, they know good and doggone well they're going to say whatever they need to say to get whatever they hope they can get out of it. And it can be the biggest bald-faced lie that, nobody would have seen coming. But at the same time, I support and I appreciate the Conviction Integrity Unit. In fact, we had a couple guys here in Florida that benefited from that. And the state attorney was very instrumental in that process. What I would like to see happen, though, is along with conviction integrity is prosecution integrity. This is why I mentioned before the practices that take place in the courtroom during the course of the trial. It seems like it's become way too much like a TV show playing out before your very own eyes, and everybody's simply out for the win, when the first obligation of any prosecutor is to seek justice, not the victory. And I think we've lost that far too well along the way here.
Well, I agree with you on that. And as prosecutors, our job is to seek justice. And as frustrating as it might be, right, when we lose a trial, if that trial has gone to a jury, then the system worked. If the person is found not guilty, as frustrated as I might be because I put all the time and the effort into doing it, if the jury says not guilty, then the system worked.
All right.
Yeah, I've always found that too. I've never been concerned about my win rate. I always want to do the right thing and to do justice. And that just actually raised for me another question. So the flip side of a wrongful conviction case means that the actual perpetrator, the actual person that committed the murder in your cases, has not been arrested, has not gone to trial. And so I'm wondering if each of you could talk about what happened in your case, if the actual perpetrator was ever found and prosecuted, or if that person still hasn't been identified to date.
Well, can I start that one? Answer that one?
Please.
In my case, the actual perpetrator was murdered by the police. In my case, the actual perpetrator was a defense witness. They got him out of jail because he told prosecutor that he know who did the crime and blah blah blah. The thing is that in trial, the actual perpetrator took the fifth, and when he took the fifth, the jurors was not around, did not hear the actual perpetrator taking the fifth. 2 years, years went by. 2 years, we could not get no information from the actual perpetrator because he died. He got killed by a police informer, by a police. When he gets killed, that's when we took more years, but 16 years or so to get information by the actual perpetrator. When they started investigating the actual perpetrator, he confessed to a lot of people. Confessed to his wife, to his sister. In the end, they even found physical evidence against the actual perpetrator. But the thing that bothered me, the actual perpetrator was in there all the time. Also, the actual perpetrator, in my case, was what they call a police informant. He was working for the police.
Kwame, you're muted.
I'm
There
sorry.
you go. There you go.
So no, for me, and you know, I think it was 2 years ago. I was doing an event and I ran into a relative of the person who had been murdered in my case, and she was the only living relative, and she happened to be an in-law. She actually wasn't a blood relative. She was married to his great nephew, and they all had died, you know, and she had been following the case, I guess just for, you know, to end things, you know. But no, they never found who done this. And I had been working with Vivid Images out of the UK. And we still got this plan to try to implement a series, sort of like, much like Richard Cameron, the Fugitive. And we've been working really hard on a programming to ascertain well, we couldn't do every case, but you know, those cases that were close to finding possibly who had actually perpetrated this crime, and getting on it, you know, and filming it to the end. And so that's one thing that you know, I've got like on the shelf, and I'm working on really tough in that particular area. But with respect to my case, no, it never happened. I wished it had happened. Like I said, the only person that was left in the case was a wife to one of the great nephews. And she said that she felt that they would have been so proud had we, at the conclusion of the case, been able to say, well, these guys did it, you know, or this guy did, or whatever, you know. So so that's a big thing. And I think you're going to run into that a lot in these cases, especially these old cases that have decades of incarceration behind them, you know. You're going to run into a lot of those where no, the people weren't caught because so much time and energy was spent creating this case, you know, and that's exactly what happened, you know. It's sad news. Also, I just want to touch, if I may, where you were talking about how I think Ron mentioned it, how the integrity squads could possibly be split, or new be up for to watch the prosecutors. You know, I think that is all in that unit. It's not said. I think it's unspoken thing. Heidi, you guys can speak to that, but I think that just a little bit of that integrity unit does, in fact, require that they do a lot of screening of prosecutorial conducts as well. Am I right with that, ladies?
Yeah, it depends on how it's set up. So that's something that really is in the discretion, at least in our state, for the district attorney, him or herself, either to have a unit and how it's set up. And so, you know, if we were looking at cases of constitutional violation, which I will do as our next district attorney, then we would be looking at cases where, you know, if evidence wasn't turned over to the defense, or there were other constitutional issues that came up during the course of the trial.
Yeah, and Kwame, I can talk to that as well. So right now, our judicial district, we don't have a conviction integrity unit in the 5th. We're a small unit, you know, so the judicial district that Amy is running for is the largest populated district, judicial district in the state. It's huge. My judicial district has a very large geographic area, but we are just over 100,000 people total. So to have a separate unit is nothing that we've ever been able to afford to do. However, one of my, one of my things that I will do as district attorney is we will implement a conviction integrity review process, because it's never been done before.
Right.
Right. And part of that process is, in fact, looking at the prosecutor's portion.
Okay, it's right.
It's not just the police work. It's not just the evidence. It's not just the witnesses that testified. It's absolutely the prosecutorial aspect of it as well, without question.
That's right.
Great.
Yes.
Then, so Ron, I don't think we got to you on the last question about whether the actual perpetrator had been found in your case.
No, from what I've told, they have not done any further investigating. The sense that I get is that they've told their story and they're sticking to it. Nobody in the police department or the state attorney's office even wants to talk to me. I understand that another gentleman with another anti-death penalty organization was trying to set up a meeting with the elected state attorney, because it was one of the circuits in the county that seeks the death penalty far more than any other. You know, Florida leads the list in death row exonerations with, I think, up to 29 now since we've reinstituted the death penalty. And I was told that when this gentleman was told that me, a recent death row exoneree, would be at that meeting, everything went 180 degrees and he decided no meeting at all. So I can't get any further information or anything on that other than what I've got in the record, my copy of the record that I've obtained.
Interesting. Well, thank you. I'm kind of shocked to hear that he wouldn't even meet with you, but keep working at it. And have you been able, Kwame, aside from you, because you talked about being able to speak to some of the family members of the person who was killed, have you been able to speak to them? Because I would presume that the family members of the person who was killed, that you were accused of committing that murder, that they were at the trial and that they sat through it. And had you ever had any contact with those family members since?
No.
Okay.
No.
And Ron?
No, I haven't had any contact with any of those other folks, but I think that's in large part because they're on the same page with the state attorney's office, and they still think I'm, the Antichrist to them. So I haven't tried to reach out to any of them, simply because I've learned over time that people will choose to believe and feel how they choose to, and the truth or the facts are irrelevant because they practically already made up their mind. So no matter what I say or do, or any goodwill I may extend to them, it's not desired or welcome. So I just decide to leave them alone and let them go about their way, because I'm not going to change their mind if they're already convinced. A lot of people can choose to accept a lie in place of the truth, and it doesn't matter what the evidence suggests or what the actual truth of the matter is. You're never going. It's like trying to convince a Democrat to become a Republican or vice versa. Some just will never budge, while others, might happily jump that fence in a heartbeat.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's just really sad to hear, Ron, after everything you've been through and you've been exonerated, that the law enforcement community is still treating you as if you're guilty. And I'm just really sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're getting close to the 7 o'clock hour. I don't know if any of the three of you have a minute or two for any closing comments before Heidi and I wrap it up. Juan, you're shaking your head. Do you?
Yes, I would like to advise you, as all you prosecutors, to be careful with the false confessions. In my case, you take my co-defendant John Beria. He falsely incriminate 3 people, including himself. So gotta be careful with the false confession. I also would like to add, prosecutors, be careful, like in my case, when they show them pictures, the horrified pictures to the juror. oh, I'm not in that picture shooting this man. I'm not in that picture cutting his throat. What that pictures did was inflame the jury, make them angry. I'm in front of them. Boom. I'm the one gonna pay the price. Emotion, when emotions get involved, innocent people get caught up in it.
Ron or Kwame, any last thoughts?
Certainly. First and foremost, thank you guys for having us. We're always willing and ready to speak this truth to not only you guys, but the world. I would like to leave you with just a thought about perseverance. I did a comment about perseverance the very first time that I spoke to the newspaper in my case. And they asked me, how did you guys make it? How did you get out of death row and how did you live and this and that? And perseverance. And in this particular sense, we're going to say that if we can come together as a unit, a dignified unit, a qualified unit, and we will persevere. We will. To triumph is always an elateful thing. Even though sometimes in losses, we can still smile and hold our heads up. But we know that unification is what makes the game work better. It's what brings solidness to the foundation. It's what the core is all about, is being unified. One stick can easily be broken and bended, but when you put them all together, the unified lock is solid and it cannot be broken. And so this is the things and the practices that I want to preach today, is that we must unify ourselves, and that when we go out into the world and march as soldiers of victory and soldiers of truth, that with that unification, that we can stand strong and shine and light the world. Thank you once again for being my friend and having me.
Thank you so much. And Ron, any last thoughts?
Yes. We're seeing out in the world today police officers being held accountable and a call for more policing of the police. We also know that prosecutors get to enjoy a certain degree of immunity, and there's a lot of things that go on in the courtroom that at the appellate court level gets brought to light, but nothing ever done to prevent and avoid that. And that's the reason I mentioned, along with conviction integrity, integrity in prosecution, because I'd rather prevent those bad acts from happening at the outset than have to come back and discover them later. But I feel like in most cases, as well as in my case, when the prosecutor is simply trying to win, nobody gets justice, not the victim, not the victim's family, and certainly not the wrongfully accused and convicted. So one of the things that I would ask is that anytime there's a bias or some reason someone has an attachment to something or something personal of their own belief or opinion, that perhaps they willingly step aside and let another prosecutor handle the case. I learned over the course of time that the mother of the victim in my case was actually employed by the state attorney's office for the same circuit that prosecuted me. And they put their two leading homicide prosecutors on my case. So this is one of those things where, we've got far too much race being injected into things, and then at the same time, we're seeing far too many injustices. But at the same time, if there's one thing we can do, is stick to that main objective of the truth, only the truth, and nothing but the truth, or the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Because the one thing that I still see standing out there is what I like to call is an incomplete investigation. Because even in my case, there's still something we don't know. And if there's still something we don't know, then the investigation is not complete. So we need to continue to investigate, no matter how long it takes, what resources are necessary before we make a bigger mistake in the courtroom with the wrongfully accused and convicted individual. And we just had a case like that down in Central Florida where the sheriff went ahead and arrested somebody because the state attorney's office wasn't moving on it. And then she had to come back and tell him, look, once you make that arrest, you started a clock that says we have to charge him in a certain amount of time. Well, we don't have all the facts, all the information yet. We're still investigating this to ensure that we have a rock solid case against the right guilty person. And I related to that very well because as a police officer, you know, I've interviewed a lot of suspects that I've arrested without reading their Miranda rights. But the difference is I was doing it, one, to ensure I had the best version of the truth I could get and that I was arresting the right person. But never did I ever put a word they spoke to me in any report I wrote. And I always told them at the end, you're going to get a lawyer. Make sure you talk to your lawyer and discuss this with them so that you can help them help you. But at the same time, I never wanted to be the one who took somebody's freedom away unrighteously, or I acted on half-truths or false information because I didn't know better. And that's what I like to see emphasized a lot more. Let's learn what we don't know so we can then ask a jury to act on the facts that we do know instead of looking at circumstantial situations which basically tell us there's something else we do not know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
Excellent.
agree, Juan, and thank you for saying that. I think that ties in both to what Juan and what Kwame were saying. We need to learn what we don't know, I appreciate all of three of you helping educate us and giving us your perspectives. You know, it's obviously you have gone through turmoils in life that the average person has not gone through, and we can't imagine it. We've never been there. So thank you so much. And we will take this and continue to learn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Again, your stories are so compelling, and I'm so glad that you share them with us because people need to hear stories like this, because most often these stories aren't heard even after someone's exonerated. And
Exactly.
so we need this information out there so that the law enforcement community and prosecutors can learn from mistakes. So we really appreciate you all taking the time to join us. And so we're going to sign off now. Thanks for everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
See you later, my
Bye.
brother.
All righty.
All right,
Good
bye-bye.
night now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.